about the Florence Farming Settlement. My name is Jessica Harney, and I'm a teacher at Camden High School. I am the AP US History teacher, so I've been able to bring my students up and do some work with the site here, some archaeological work. I'm also a volunteer at a couple of local research and historical and educational societies, such as the Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission. And so through my work with these groups, it's developed a further interest in this site. I first heard about the Florence Farming Association and settlement back in 2008, and I had a lot of questions, but I didn't have the time to do any research with it. So it wasn't until 2013 that my colleague Janine Bloomquist and I, who's here, Janine, Janine and I attended a workshop for teachers to learn how to use primary sources and integrate them into the classroom. And that workshop was put on by Diana Wendell from Madison Oneida BOCES, former SLS director. So thank you, Diana, for getting us involved in the document side of the research. And we shared our excitement with some of the people we knew at the Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, and that led to a mutual contact that basically was able to kind of jockey all of us together, which brought in Paul and Mary Liz Stewart, who are the caretakers and directors, co-founders of the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence out in Albany. And so that brings their interest here to this site. With them, they invited us along on an exploratory trip to this site. So through some of the research that they had done and some people that they knew had done, we felt that it was time for a site visit. And so there's a large team of us in 2014 that came out through their collaboration and guidance, and that included members of the New York State Museum, the New York State DEC, and also professional archaeologist Matt from Hartgen Archeological Associates. And so we just came out and played in the woods for a day, and we came to the conclusion that this was something, and that we wanted to do more, and we wanted to identify the site. We wanted to maybe do more with students up here, whichever students that may be, whether it's local college students or Camden High School students. But our mission kind of all revolved around education and trying to get students up here to start either doing hands-on learning, but also we wanted to identify the site so that it wasn't a history mystery anymore. And so I want to tell you a little bit about some of the documentation that helped us come to the conclusion that this is where the settlement was, or close to where the settlement was. How we define community or settlement can kind of change our meaning and understanding of the place, but there's a lot of documentation that supports this place and people coming and going through this area, whether it be newspapers, deeds, letters, editorials, census data, and maps. We were able to use this information to apply for a grant to purchase the sign. The grant was available by the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, and they provide these grants throughout the state. When your region becomes available, you jump on it. And so we quickly pulled together this information. I did a lot of the document research, but with a lot of help. And much of what I did was just organizing the information to tell the story. Many others have done this research and have made the documents available. A lot of historical research and archaeological research, the mission of public history is to share resources. And so I'm really grateful that I was, no one was saying, this is mine, this is my story, I'm going to tell it. Everybody was just excited about this project, to share resources and to share our understanding of this place. So it was really a group effort, and obviously, we can thank the William G. Pomeroy Foundation for providing the grant to be able to purchase the sign. They awarded the grant to the Oneida County Historical Society, who we wrote the grant on behalf of, because we felt that this was an Oneida County story, not a Camden High School or an Abolition Hall of Fame or a Stephen Myers resident story. This was an Oneida County story. So that grant was awarded to them, and they purchased the sign with our help. We could not have done the sign without the help of the Florence Town Board and the community. The Florence Town Board, this is on their right of way, so we had to obtain permission from them to be able to bring the sign here. And we thank them for that opportunity and supporting us in that endeavor. We did receive the sign late in 2016, but we pushed the dedication off to this year because it gets cold up here fast, and we didn't want anybody to miss out, and so we wanted to have enough time to be able to do everything that we wanted to do to get all of the appropriate groups connected to get out here. So we see with this site a clear timeline that Stephen Myers obtained land from an abolitionist named Gerrit Smith. Gerrit Smith is an abolitionist that's from Peterboro, but he owned a lot of land in Florence. And he was working on the mission of helping African Americans that were newly freed to obtain enough land so that they could have voting rights at that time. And so with Stephen Myers obtaining this land from Gerrit Smith, he started to work to promote this group called the Florence Farming Association, or the Florence Farming Settlement. In a lot of different documents we see it written in different ways, and so it does seem like it was an incorporated group, and we also can see that there was a planned, coordinated effort for a community to grow here. Some other notable abolitionists that spoke about the site was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass's involvement is still not completely clear how he got involved, but there's more to that story to be found and told. But he's not completely connected to it the entire time, which is why his name's not on the sign, but Stephen Myers is. Other abolitionists is Walter Hawkins, whom Jan Diamici, who's here from the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, is going to speak briefly about. The timeline goes like this. Free African Americans began obtaining land from Gerrit Smith in the 1840s. We have documentation 1846 for this site. According to historic documents, we can see evidence of a call for a convention to take place in January of 1848. And they claim it was to adopt means for emigrating into the West, that's here, to occupy lands given by Gerrit Smith and to appoint agents of lecture on agriculture. So it tells us a little bit about what they're hoping to accomplish. A year later, newspapers like the Corrector of Sag Harbor are printing about the development of the site. So we can see that it's changing over time. And they refer to the site as Gerrit Smith's colored settlement in Florence. A quote from the paper: "The property has plenty of water power, and grist and sawmills have been projected. Mr. Smith has given a number of farms to enterprising colored persons, and the Florence Association intend to purchase several hundred acres around them. In the settlement, the village lots are selling for $3 per lot. The lots contain a quarter of an acre each, which will enable each person to have 30 acres with the advantage of timber." Later that year, the Albany Argus in June further explains the growth of the Florence settlement. It begins to describe the purpose of the settlement, and they start citing leaders of the settlement, the leadership organization of the Florence Farming Association, citing Daniel Benton as president of what they are now referring to as Florence Farming Association, and Stephen Myers as the chairman of the board. We then go on to find numerous deeds, examples where Smith is selling land to African American men. You can cross-reference those deeds with the 1850 and 1860 census to identify how long, when they arrived, and how long they stayed, and then begin to tell the narrative of this is a community of people. There's also a beautifully detailed 1858 map of Oneida County that lists the names of property owners on the map. And that map, a copy of that map is actually in the Florence Town Hall. So if you come back afterward, then you'll be able to go and see that map. But that map was really instrumental in actually showing us the plots. Then we come out to the land, we start to walk the land, and you find structures. So we can find numerous structures out here in the site, rock formations, foundations, piles of stones, and a well. So there's evidence that a community was here. The selection for this spot for the sign is it's placed near a cluster of African American homes. There were about 6 families identified on that map from here, and those names are cross-referenced with 1850 and 1860 census. We also know Stephen Myers acted as president and general agent of the Florence Farming Association, which encouraged blacks to occupy and farm the land that was originally owned by Gerrit Smith. So Paul and Mary Liz are here, and Paul is going to speak briefly about Stephen Myers and his connection to the site. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you all for being here. This is really special for us for a variety of reasons. I mean, simply, of course, the story of Stephen Myers, which is a story that a lot of this history, I think, sort of, for many people, pops out of nowhere. You know, you're not necessarily reading this in your standard history textbooks. You know, it's very close community history, and yet there's a lot of detail there. There are things about that happened in the 19th century in this region and really all over the country that where there were so many twists and turns and exciting things that happen that we usually don't hear about at all. So this is one of those places, and Stephen Myers and the others who were involved here are among those people that had very, very special stories. People moved around a lot more in the 19th century than we give them credit for. We always think of, well, they're in wagons, you know, with whatnot. They must be traveling slow, and yet people did travel a lot. They seem to have greater capacity to sit and listen. I think about people spending several hours listening to lectures, whether it was out at Chautauqua in Western New York or at their individual churches right in their own communities. So there were a lot of things about the 19th century. We know that the Erie Canal was a technological wonder that was completed in the mid-1820s and really fueled a lot of growth and development throughout the 19th century period and even into today. There's so much more about that could be said, but let's just take a step back and think about Stephen Myers. New York, as you know, was a slave state until 1827. Around 1800, moving to 1827, there was the progressive abolition of slavery in New York State. Stephen Myers was born about 1800. He was born over in Rensselaer County at a place called Hoosick, Four Corners. One thing led to another. He wound up in the city of Albany. He grew up in Albany, somewhat in the household of the Yates family, which a lot of the children were placed with white families when slavery was being transitioned out. The rationale was, the thinking was that the households were who had been set free were indigent, had no sources of support, and so the Yates family was the Abraham Yates was a sailmaker and the leading presbyter for the First Presbyterian Church in Albany. It was his son, one of his sons became a doctor, and his son became an explorer. So it was a household that was very alert to science and learning. So Stephen grew up in that context. He got his freedom probably at the age of 18. The next decade and a half, he worked as a steamboat steward and as a seller of groceries. he got into the early 1830s, and he got very excited about the development of newspapers and printing, and he started being involved with various kinds of newspaper projects. And so in the 1830s, he was involved with a publication called The Elevator. In the early 1840s, he became involved with a newspaper called the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate. Most people are familiar with the North Star of the 1850s and Frederick Douglass, but this was the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate. This North Star, Northern Star was a theme that was very popular among those who wanted to see slavery abolished, because many people who escaped with the Underground Railroad used the North Star as a guide to find their way north. So this newspaper in the 1840s, Stephen, in the late 1840s, as he began to be involved in this project here, he renamed it the Northern Star and Colored Farmer. So the rest of Stephen's life, we have a large truck coming here, so this guy, we might take just a pause. But the rest of Stephen's life was very much wrapped up in the project, if you will, not only of African American freedom in terms of working in connection with the Underground Railroad, but also with other projects, other things that could be important to undergirding that freedom. So he worked for voting rights, he worked in developing schools, and one of the other things that he did was that he worked to develop economic development projects like this Florence Farming and Lumber Association. And so his involvement here was very much to help it come together and to promote it, and he did speaking all over New England and around the region to try to encourage people to come and settle here. One of the things that happened for the community here was that they identified these smaller plots for people to be living on and doing a personal garden on, that sort of thing, while with the idea that they would also work together on larger projects in terms of farming, the processing of the lumber, the creation of the mills and other tools that they needed in order to make the community thrive. And so Stephen was very much involved in all of that. Stephen Myers as an individual, I think in some respects, the work that he did has long been overlooked. There are a whole host of reasons for that, and I don't know that I want to get into them just now, but what one of the things that certainly made a difference in terms of people recognizing the work that he did was that the various projects that he worked on didn't necessarily always have printed material that went with them. He did have the newspaper, but he didn't spend a lot of time writing about himself or writing his personal papers, that sort of thing. So so that's among the reasons why he wasn't as recognized. But we're very, very pleased that Jessica had gotten involved with this project and had the students coming out here on so many occasions. There was a beautiful story done in the Conservation magazine about the work that the students had been doing, and I think it's a real opportunity for us to really zero in on the special nature of this community and this space, and I think it's really wonderful that we're able to do this today. So thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you all.
Thank you, Paul. I also want to invite Jan Diamici to speak briefly about Walter Hawkins, who was a freedom seeker who settled in this community. Jan Diamici is the co-chair of the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission. Thank you.
I'm co-chair of the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission. We've been working for, I think, 13 years, and our focus has been the pursuit of the Underground Railroad in Oneida County. It is broadened now to learning about the resistance to slavery, at the Abolition movement, Underground Railroad, but there was a broader resistance to slavery as well. I can't tell the whole story, but I'd like to tell you one story. And it's a story of a freedom seeker, or a fugitive, or an escaped slave, there are a number of terms that are used, who came here And although the words I'm going to read to you are not his word for word, the person who wrote his autobiography with him put his words into prose. So as I read certain things to you, I want you to think of this as Walter Hawkins is talking to us about why did he come here. So Walter Hawkins, give you a minute, was born enslaved in Georgetown, Maryland, near Washington, D.C., and 1809, best we can recall. Most of his family was sold off under the conditions of enslavement, and when he was about to be sold to a slave dealer, his father told him, run away. He was about 15, 20, a teenager, right? Because that was a dangerous thing. If they were going to sell you, it was probably going to end up in Louisiana or Mississippi. So he ran away. And I've been reading his autobiography as helped by Celestine Edwards. And he talks about, well, he went here, he went there, he went to Philadelphia, and then he ended up in Buffalo, New York, and then he ended up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then he came here. Eventually, he leaves here, not eventually, it only took about 2 years. I'll tell you about that in a minute as well. Why did he leave? And he ended up in Canada with his wife and his 3 children. He married his wife and sired his 3 children in New Bedford, where he lived for 8 years. He couldn't quite make a living in New Bedford. It was tough. And so he had heard about this agricultural experiment, this farming experiment, which would, among other things, if it worked, give him the right to vote. You had to have property worth $250 back then is a lot of money in order to be a black voter. Whites didn't have that. So here was an opportunity to get out from under crushing poverty and to finally have a piece of property that would allow him to vote with his family and his children. He was going to give it a shot. All right? Now, think of this as his words, although sometimes he is referred to in the third person. Nothing but enthusiasm would have influenced a man like Hawkins, who was ignorant of the art of farming, to take his family, consisting of wife and 3 children, from a town like New Bedford, which offered so many advantages to a black man, to dive into the backwoods, almost penniless, to start a new life. Nothing doubting, in company with some other families, they went into the state of New York to a place called Florence. Having arrived, they felt that their primary duty was to clear away a site and make provision for their bodily comfort. Probably looked a lot like this, except probably the trees were bigger, because it was probably first growth, right? To secure this, they plunged into the forest as quickly as possible, clearing everything before them. Then they built log cabins, converted the bark into money, burned the bark as potash, and sent timber to the sawmills, part of the grand plan that Stephen Myers had in mind. Besides keeping a large stock to burn during the cold season, so that when the wind began to proclaim the advent of winter, they found themselves fairly well provided for. He's speaking in positive terms. As their wants were neither many or great, they were perfectly satisfied with the common necessaries of life. Hawkins himself was far better provided for than when he was a slave in Maryland. They managed to struggle comfortably through the bitter cold winter, much better than their highest anticipations gave them warrant. Towards the summer, Walter began to think how he could augment his funds. I have a hunch a lot of these people found it very difficult to accumulate the necessaries to farm. I mean, just cutting down, I don't have to go into that, but you can understand. You walk into this, and where do you start? And how do you start to go? So finding himself so near the Saratoga Springs, the thought occurred to him that he might turn over some ready money there. Sure enough, he thought rightly, after having sown his crop, so he did farm. He betook himself to the springs, leaving his wife, who was a real help to him, to look after affairs. For 3 or 4 months of the year, this hard-working good woman would attend to the farm, and they're calling it a farm, right? Without neglecting her duty to her children. As the fall advanced, Walter would leave Saratoga and get home in time to reap his harvest. Sounds like he was growing something. He doesn't really say what. To keep the wolf from the door, besides putting by a little. But in the midst of prosperity, just as if a black man had no earthly right to any luxury, when everything bid fair towards compensating him for all his past misfortunes, and just when fate began to pour upon him some blessings for the vinegar and gall which the curse of slavery had made him drink, these are his words, I'm thinking, trouble came. not from the potato blight, nor a plague of locusts to devastate his crops, nor from any epidemic which threatened to break through and shatter his family circle, but as though the man was born to be disappointed and sentenced to lifelong trouble, only to be relieved with enough pleasure for him to know what happiness was really like. The anti-slave, Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 put an end to his dream, because that Slave Act meant that every free person was essentially part of a slave-catching posse. No black person, free or enslaved, was safe, and he left. He could have left his wife behind and his children. They were free. They were born free. But what were they going to do without him? And where do you go? He went to Canada, as so many people did. His dream ended just like that. He ends up in Canada and becomes, eventually, the long story, it is the British Methodist Episcopal Church. He becomes a bishop in this church and ends his life as a revered bishop and leader, not just of African Americans, but of indeed of people of faith. I just thought a little story like that puts this on the map in a personal sense. Thank you.
Another big part of our ability to be here has been the really great collaboration we've been able to establish with the New York State DEC. We want to thank Christy Premu and Chuck Vandry, and especially thank today Fred Monk for coming down. Fred Monk is our Natural Resource Supervisor for Region 6, and just being able to know that the state is aware that this place meant something is really important, and it will help prolong the preservation of this historic site. Chuck is going to speak for a few minutes about the land and the importance of preservation.
Yeah, I'll be real brief. Really talk about two things. One, how this came to be state land, and why places like this are important as something that all of us have an ownership interest in. The state forest system. State forests, of course, are different from state parks. They're different from the forest preserve and other sorts of categories of public land that we have in New York State. Where state forest came from is that basically in the 1930s, when the Great Depression was kind of gripping the country, gripping New York especially, a lot of farmland that was kind of in marginal areas of the state was being abandoned, basically. It was going to the counties for taxes. The counties didn't know what to do with it. Well, we had a governor at that time by the name of Franklin Roosevelt who, well, started to do something about that. Basically, he created a system called the state reforestation system. They essentially decided that, well, if these lands couldn't really be farms, maybe the best thing for them was to grow trees on. And so the state reforestation system came into being, I think it was 1936 when it started. Actually, 32, sorry. Date's right. And it's grown ever since then. Now there are about 800,000 acres of state forests all across the state. And their purpose is not only producing timber, that's what we do, we sell timber off this land, but it's also recreation, watershed protection, and over the years we've come to learn that there's lots more to it than even those things. You know, we talk about things like ecosystem protection and large-scale ecosystem sorts of things that we need big chunks of land to support, you know, the kinds of animal populations that we need. We've also come to learn that substantial portions of the state's history are in places like this. And that's where people like me, I'm an archaeologist by training, by the way, that we come in that, you know, these building foundations and other things that are scattered across state land, those very often reflect very important parts of the state's history. And a place like this, a place like, you know, Florence State Forest, where we have essentially a community where we have documentary evidence, we know who those people are, we can research their lives, we can understand who they were related to, how they were connected to one another, and how they were connected to things that were going on in the state and in the country. And then we can take that information and actually go out on the ground and find where that person lived, and begin to look. You know, a lot of things about history are not written down, but when you can look at the kinds of things they owned, how big their house was, how many rooms it had, how big was the barn, what sorts of things were they growing out there, we can begin to answer all sorts of questions that we can't answer from documentary research. And bringing it to where bringing the kids involved in that, one of the things that I've always enjoyed, in working for New York State is the idea that we have different disciplines. You have biologists working with foresters and archaeologists working with foresters, and we even throw an engineer in once in a while. In this case, we've got kids who are working on historical research, doing really good historical research, and we bring them in and we teach them a little bit about archaeology, and they connect another piece of what they're doing to a completely different field, and realize that those two fields actually support one another. I think why places like this are important as state land is that once something is on state land, public land, it should be protected forever. We're not going to put a shopping mall on it. We're not going to probably aren't going to build a road through it. And so this place theoretically can be here forever if we don't destroy it. So one of the other things that we've learned over the years that have become part of our mission as land managers is protecting places like this from people who want to do damage to them. Pot hunters and bottle hunters and the guys with the metal detectors. We're looking out for those folks too, so that places like this can be here for the long term, and not only to answer questions now, but also to answer questions in 50 years or 100 years when people are looking at history completely differently than we are now.
And thanks. Can you just reiterate the legalities over land off items found?
Basically any materials, anything that's on the land is basically owned by the people of the state. We all have an ownership interest in it, and nobody has the right to take it off that land without asking permission. There is a process that we go through. For example, to do this project, not only did the DEC have to give permission, but the State Museum actually has a role in historic things that are on state land. They get to decide whether it should stay there or should it come off. Because in many cases, the best thing to do with archaeological sites is leave them where they are. It's the safest for them. Leave them alone, and they'll be fine. So we have to be very careful, very deliberate about making those kinds of decisions before we let research happen on the land. So one of the things we do is we do discourage those other guys who come out and do damage to things. And the forest rangers can give them all sorts of tickets that basically kind of wreck their day.
Thank you very much, Chuck. At this time, I'd like to invite the stewards and Mr. Diamicis, if he'd like to join us, and Chuck as well, and Matt, please, because Matt, you helped with this a lot. So, all right. We're going to unveil the sign. We're going to pull that now. Okay. Thank you very much. The site was about growing and creating a community in order to advance the lives of the people involved socially, politically, and economically. And while the settlement didn't gain sustainability due to a lot of outside pressures, such as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and obviously eventually a brewing civil war, I would say that the spirit of the community has remained. And that's evidenced by the fact that the interest around learning and preserving the memory of this site has brought together so many groups and agencies and individuals from around the state. I want to thank those groups for their collaborative efforts and continued support of this endeavor. Camden High School, thank the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, the Underground Railroad History Project, and the Stephen Myers residents. The New York State DEC, Historic Preservation, especially Fred Monk today for coming, Region 6 Natural Resource Supervisor. Also Matt Kirk from Hartgen Archeological Associates, the Town of Florence, and the Oneida County Historical Society. I want to offer personal thanks to my colleagues Janine Bloomquist, Ben Mitchell, Linda Williams, Diana Wendell, and Dan Carver for helping to bring my students to this site for further research the last 2 years. I'd also like to thank my husband and family for not only coming today, but encouraging me to keep asking questions and find a way to bring a reality here. There are a lot of others of you that are represented here that maybe have just recently learned about the site and are looking forward to becoming a part of whatever the future will hold regarding this site. And so I would definitely like to invite all of you to come back to the Florence Town Hall and thank you by providing cake and cider and maybe some community building and an opportunity to view the Gillette's map from 1858 of Oneida County. Thank you very much for coming.